Welcome to Amazing Graves, where together we'll discover the ways cemeteries can unlock the incredible history that surrounds us. I'm Dr. Thomas Henthorn, Wyatt Endowed Professor of Public History at the University of Michigan Flint. And today, we're going to talk about two topics that don't often get discussed together: cemeteries and urban renewal. And even though we're using an example in Flint, there are examples of similar stories in communities across the United States. So let's start with this curious row of headstones here at Avondale Cemetery in Flint. Avondale was inspired by the Lawn Park Cemetery, and you can see some classic elements of that design with some uniformity in the landscape and the monuments. The interred were originally arranged in lots when the cemetery was created in 1876, but the landscape has changed to incorporate rows and even a few crypts. Avondale also butts up against Aventine Cemetery. It's a smaller cemetery that sits on the site of Camp Thompson. Camp Thompson was a Civil War training camp for the 10th Michigan Infantry during the winter of 1861 and 1862. Edward Thompson, a local attorney and civic leader, was the first to be in charge of the tent. The men would train regularly for several months before leaving in April of 1862 to join the 2nd Brigade. Today, the cemetery continues its association with the Civil War. There's a large number of interred men here, and thanks to the Governor Crapo camp of the Sons of Civil War veterans, the cemetery receives regular maintenance. But this area, known as Pioneers Row at the western edge of Avondale Cemetery, definitely stands out as the most distinct part of the cemetery. You've got some veterans markers and very old marble mixed with 20th century granite. So how do these markers end up here, like this? It has everything to do with a set of policies aimed at remaking American cities in the 20th century, something called urban renewal. After World War II, Americans invested in their cities to help boost economic growth and make cities more livable. It sounded like a great idea at the time. The federal government would give cities funding to clean up their impoverished areas and invest in affordable housing and urban infrastructure projects. The federal policies we sort of bunched together as urban renewal did help American cities address real infrastructure needs. But since planners focused most of these funds on raising blighted or slum neighborhoods, we tend to remember urban renewal for its devastating consequences, like displacing millions of people from their homes, most of whom were poor communities of color. So what does all this have to do with cemeteries? Over time, cities used federal funds to stimulate commercial and industrial redevelopment. And they looked at places near downtowns and older industrial sites that could be redeveloped. Now, in most cities and towns in the United States, the community's first cemeteries were located pretty close to downtown. But when people talk about the people displaced from urban renewal, we tend to forget about the folks below ground.
For example, in Philadelphia alone, developers and policymakers replaced many of Philadelphia's historic cemeteries with playgrounds, parking lots, and retail developments. Between 1945 and 1970, Philadelphia lost the Union Burial Ground, established in 1841, Lafayette, 1838, Franklin, 1840, Ronaldson, 1827, Bellevue, 1855, the Oddfellows Cemetery, 1849, United American Mechanics Monument, built in 1850, St. Mary's Cemetery, which existed from 1840 to 1956, and the German Lutheran Cemetery, which existed from 1880 until 1869.
That's thousands of displaced people in just one city. So multiply that by all the large and small communities across the U.S., including Flint. And that brings us back to this curious group of stones at Avondale Cemetery. These folks are part of Flint's legacy of displacement from urban renewal projects. So where do they all come from if this isn't the original resting place? Well, we don't have to go far. One of Flint's very first cemeteries was right here, just a few hundred yards from downtown's main avenue. Residents called it the Old City Cemetery, and the first burial was around 1842. That's only a few decades after the first white settlers arrived in this area. By the 1950s, though, many residents saw the cemetery as an eyesore, and local developers felt the site was perfect for the kinds of economic improvement projects urban renewal funded. So Albert Courts proposed the Central River Project in 1958, which eventually sealed the fate of the cemetery. Like most cities, local developers were working with city government to inject some kind of economic activity. After all, this was also a time when millions of white Americans were leaving the cities for suburbs.
People had been eyeing this site for almost a decade when the Central River Project began. A local dairy asked to have part of the cemetery vacated in 1952. And the current project fit with plans already envisioned by local city officials to improve crosstown traffic patterns and better connect factories. And the Central River project was part of that strategy to attract and keep people spending money in the city.
In fact, city officials were touting the Central River project to attract business to broaden Flint's economy. For a city known as a car manufacturer, you could see as early as the 1950s, when car factories were flush with workers, that Flint civic leaders were busy trying to diversify the local market. The centerpiece of the development became the new Central Post Office, and there were big plans for other large complexes on the 35-acre site. In the end, the post office remained the largest structure, with a number of smaller offices scattered about.
Like many urban renewal projects, after clearing the land of its previous use, the Central River project never really delivered on the hype it promised.
But let's wind the clock back to the beginning of the project before the land was vacated. Clearing land for development is always a challenge. But what about when that land is a cemetery? It turns out it's actually much cheaper to relocate the dead than the living. And developers devised a plan to remove the interred and the headstones. But without an accurate record for the entire cemetery, they had to rely on surveyors to identify plots.
In total, they removed 1,199 bodies, 925 of which were unidentified. Any family members who wanted to claim someone buried in the cemetery could have the remains removed and reinterred at a cemetery of their choice for a flat fee. The other locations were Flint's new city cemetery, which was created as a memorial park in 1925.
The majority were reinterred here at Avondale Cemetery, along with 120 markers in Pioneers Avenue.
Merle Perry, a local museum curator and genealogist, created the books on just about every cemetery in Genesee County in the 1960s, and he named this section when he created a book for Avondale in 1962.
We don't have any records for how the remains were reinterred, but you don't have to be an expert on cemeteries to see that the groupings of markers suggest some form of burial other than single plots. So who were these people in Pioneers Avenue? Solomon Hopkins came to Flint to live with his son George and his family. The Hopkins had been living in New York, and like many of Michigan's early white settlers, migrated to Michigan along the Great Lakes shipping route that connected the East Coast, which what was then known as the Western Frontier. George Torrey enlisted as a substitute in the U.S. Army in August 1864 for Norton Ferris. Substitution, the ability to substitute someone in your place for military service, was pretty standard practice for European and American armies, even peacetime militia service. During the Civil War, a principal, the person avoiding service, would accompany a substitute to the camp of instruction, where a surgeon would have to judge the substitute medically fit for duty. There was usually some money that changed hands as well. So substitution exposed how wealth could help you avoid the dangers of conflict. And military conflict was incredibly dangerous during the Civil War. Rifles and artilleries became more accurate. But as we learned in another Amazing Graves episode, the most common source of death in the military was disease. And that's exactly what happened to Private Torrey. He never even made it out of training camp and died at the post hospital in Jackson, Michigan in January 1865 without ever seeing combat. There were a lot of Joseph Rileys in Flint. Joseph was an immigrant from Dublin, Ireland, and made his way to Michigan via New York. We don't know much about Joseph, except for the fact that he was likely not attached to any church. Irish Americans were almost exclusively Catholic in the mid-19th century, and had Joseph been associated with the one Catholic parish in Flint, St. Michael's, he would have been buried in the Catholic cemetery, about 3 miles away. And mixed in with the folks in Pioneers Avenue were people like Florence Holly. Florence was born in Holland, Michigan, and she and her husband were living in Charlevoix, Michigan, but moved to Flint in 1910, when her husband Joseph found work as a machine setter in Flint's expanding automotive industry.
Florence was one of many victims in 1918 of the Great Flu Pandemic that lasted until the following year. We often refer to this as the Spanish flu pandemic, and it's estimated that hundreds of millions of people, or 1/3 of the world's population, became infected with this virus. The number of deaths was estimated to be at least 50 million worldwide, with about 675,000 occurring in the United States. What made this pandemic so unusual was the high mortality rate of people in the prime of their life. The flu had typically been hard on people under 5 or over 65.
But in 1918 and 1919, people like Florence, somebody who was healthy and about 20 to 45 years old, had abnormally high mortality rates.
As I said, the vision for the land where these folks were originally interred
was part of the plan to radically alter the downtown landscape and spur economic development. Developers were planning a large hotel with convention space and a campus of multi-story office buildings. Considering Flint was a city whose economy depended on industrial workers, the fact that planners were trying to attract workers from the service economy demonstrates what historian Thomas Segru discussed as one of the origins of the urban crisis: the slow and deliberate shift from a labor-intensive industrial economy to a capital-intensive service economy. None of this ever materialized. Most of the new developments were a handful of smaller office buildings, which left the post office as the biggest thing ever built here. That is until 1985, when our story picks up again. Flint's planners and developers continued to try a number of strategies to inject life into the local economy. By 1985, it was pretty clear that Flint's local market was seriously shifting away from car production. And downtown continued to be the focus of urban renewal. By 1985, Flint had an interstate spur that brought people closer to the urban core, a project which also displaced thousands of people. Developers used urban renewal incentives to clear acres of land in one of Flint's poorest neighborhoods for an industrial park. And several blocks of downtown were demolished or remodeled to make room for Auto World, an extremely short-lived theme park, a festival marketplace to attract retail, my place of employment, the University of Michigan Flint, and of course hotels to accommodate what developers hoped would be the throngs of people spending money in Flint's new economy. And speaking of hotels, that's what brings us back to the site of the old city cemetery. In February 1985, local developers received the tax breaks they had lobbied for to build a new hotel and conference center and redevelop some of the surrounding offices. And just like urban renewal projects in the past, developers, planners, and government officials forecasted big returns on these types of investments for the community. This time, the type of service economy Flint was attempting to cultivate was tourism. They were following the lead of a lot of industrial cities like Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, to remake their image as a gritty, smoke-stacked landscape to a place filled with the amenities that could capture the attention of summer travel. They broke ground on June 11, 1985, with the usual fanfare that included Mayor James Sharp, flanked by representatives of state and federal government, the Chamber of Commerce, and a few local dignitaries. But by the following week, the project ran into a major obstacle. Tom Bauman, the site foreman directing the construction crew, halted work when he saw that one of the workers had unearthed a human skull. After careful examination of ground around the skull, they noticed another. From that point, Bauman had his crew shut down the excavating equipment and had them probe the site with hand shovels and sticks. Bauman admitted they didn't really know what they had found at first. But by the time they were done probing around the site, they found the outline of 8 graves, with several skeletons and the remnants of wooden coffins. Needless to say, this put the project on hold until they could figure out what to do. But it was pretty clear that the remains were bodies that had been missed during the original disinterment in 1958. After inspection by the Genesee County Health Department, the remains were reinterred at New Flint City Cemetery. But as work progressed, they continued to find remains. In August, they found 6 more, and by the end of the summer, a total of 24 remains had been identified. It's pretty likely that the only reason they stopped finding remains is because they stopped digging and began building up. So the likelihood that there are additional bodies at rest here is pretty high. When they stopped finding bodies, officials from Zelli Funeral Home, who'd been assisting with the disinterments, arranged a mass funeral for all 24 of the deceased, officiated by local clergy representing Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish houses of worship. Urban renewal was about big plans, which is why so many people felt comfortable about the decisions to displace so many people, dead or alive. The benefits of the development that would follow the clearance of land was supposed to outweigh the cost. But in many ways, urban renewal was often a legacy of unrealized dreams. That was true in a number of American cities, and that was certainly true in Flint. So it's ironic that the final victims of displacement for one of Flint's urban renewal projects would end up here at the New Flint City Cemetery. City officials began planning the cemetery in 1922, and they accepted the first burials in 1925. The original plan called for a large memorial park that would eventually take up all 80 acres. Planners envisioned sweeping roads that curved around a contoured landscape that combined small hills, gently rolling fields, a large plain in the middle, and water features. By 1925, the original Flint City Cemetery was closed to burials, and this cemetery accepted burials up into the 1990s. But like so many of the urban renewal ideas for Flint, the plans for this site never really materialized. And just like urban renewal, it plunged those most affected by the decisions into deeper decline. The City of Flint department that used to run this site has lost revenue and personnel. And although the existing staff does their best to keep things in order, records for those reinterred in 1958, 1985, and any internments for that matter, are scattered at best. And in the same way that urban renewal vanished people, dead or alive, and places, the legacy of those decisions that didn't really pay off continue to do great and lasting harm to the most vulnerable of our living and deceased residents in our cities.